Hello. Well, not long now before the country goes to the polls on the 4th of July. But what's your opinion on the offerings from the main parties? Have you made your mind up yet which way you're going to vote? Welcome to Grey Matters. Hello and welcome to Grey Matters, the channel that promotes the fact that the older generation still matters and has relevance, and which looks at issues that matter to the older generation. This channel has always been and always will be non-political, and by that I mean we will not nail our flag to any particular party political mast. If politics do make it to air, then it will be in the context of issues that could or do affect the older generation. However, the general election is something that we can't let pass us by without including it, really, can we? And unless you've been living on another planet or under a rock, you'll know that the general election is being held in a couple of weeks on the 4th of July. Here at Grey Matters Towers, we've got our polling cards, and hopefully you have yours too. But are you actually going to vote? Or are you so disaffected with all the political wrangling that you don't see any point? Well, our beloved parties have been just releasing their manifestos and have been lobbying for your vote for a couple of weeks now. And what a couple of weeks they've been. I mean, the sudden and fairly meteoric rise of Reform UK under the leadership of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, television debates that became almost unintelligible thanks to the candidates all shouting over each other, Labour out there campaigning whilst the Tories appear to be concentrating more on trying to prevent reform from gaining ground instead of lobbying for your votes. Now, the consensus is that Sir Keir Starmer will be forming the next government, and from the polls I think that's a fairly safe bet. But what of Conservatives and Reform? The polls are swinging back and forth about who's in second place, and the Lib Dems aren't really putting on much of a show at all. In the past they've always been considered as the third party, but what's happened to them now? And what about these manifestos? Do you know what the parties currently stand for? Well, let's take a look at their promises, inverted commas. We've picked up some of the main points from the top four parties, and we'll start with the Lib Dems. They plan to take the UK back into the single market with a view to rejoining the EU, and maybe in an attempt to achieve that, they plan to reduce the voting age to 16. Now, the manifesto places a lot of importance on healthcare. They plan to introduce free personal care in England, where people needing help with daily tasks won't have to pay for it. Now, it's already available, but it's means tested at the moment with only the poorest receiving help. I imagine it'll probably have to be assessment based, with everyone entitled to ask for an assessment, but does that necessarily mean they'll get the help they need? They promise 8,000 more GPs in England, but the promise seems to be a bit incomplete because they've not specified if there'll be fully trained GPs or qualified doctors training for general practice. And from day one at medical school, it takes up to 10 years to fully qualify for general practice. Now, for their public spending programme, they want to spend £27 billion a year more by 2029, and they plan to raise levies on banks, netting another £4 billion. And they want to raise more than £5 billion by reforming capital gains tax. Now, one policy that could be very divisive is an aviation duty destined to penalise frequent flyers. On immigration, the manifesto sounds very temperate, and supporters of tougher border controls might find it a bit too wishy-washy. It reinforces Britain's proud history of welcoming newcomers and wants controls that treat everyone with respect. Well, don't we all? But there's no suggestion that they intend to reduce immigration numbers. They also want an end to the ban on foreign care workers bringing over their dependents. And, in line with the Conservatives and Reform, the Lib Dems plan to remove the two-child limit, which affects universal credit and child tax credit. And the end also to the benefit cap, which limits how much a household can claim in benefits. They also have an ambitious plan to reduce the waiting time for the first universal credit payment from 5 weeks to 5 days. Wow. Now they plan to bring in legislation to recognise non-binary identities. Now this is to cater for approximately 30,000 people who don't accept the concept that there's just two genders. Now this follows unsuccessful attempts in the past to have them legally recognised. Okay, so that's the Lib Dems. Anything there that you're not happy with? Anything there that you really like? Let's know in the comments. So next up in the polls, we've got the Conservatives. There are two items in the Tory manifesto worth mentioning from our demographics point of view. The first is a promise to increase the personal tax-free allowance for pensioners. Now this would mean future rises in state pension will not be hit by income tax. The Tories say that tax cuts will be paid for by a crackdown on tax avoidance and by cutting the welfare bill by £12 billion a year. However, before you get too excited, analysts and financial experts think it's very unlikely to happen. The second item is an £86,000 cap on social care costs. Now this will be for people who are older or disabled, and it means that no one will pay more than £86,000 for that sort of personal care over their lifetime. However, there's little information on how it will be funded. They also plan a legal limit on migration by getting Parliament to agree on the number of visas that will be issued on an annual basis. Now, seeing how Parliament seldom agrees on anything, I wonder how practical that is. And they also plan to resume flights to Rwanda for the deportation of illegal migrants. Now, in a potentially bold move, they intend to fund spending pledges by cutting civil service numbers, which should save nearly £4 billion. Now I remember what happened when Jim Hacker tried to do that in Yes Minister. It never ends well when you mess with the civil service mandarins. And they also want to save £550 million by cutting 5,500 NHS managers. Spending on defence will increase, according to the manifesto, with a commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on security. They've set a target to do this for 2030, but this is through cumulative spending year on year. Now, good news for the self-employed, they will benefit under the Tory manifesto, and that's through the abolition of national insurance for them. The cut is promised by the end of next Parliament and will cost £2.6 billion a year. Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but would cutting NI contributions for the self-employed have a detrimental effect on their state pensions in years to come? If you're a financial whiz and you know the answer to that, please let me know in the comments. The manifesto also plans to return the Help to Buy scheme. If you remember that, it helps people to get onto the property ladder. Now the scheme will provide first-time buyers with an equity loan of up to 20% towards the cost of a new home. And the Tories intend to build 1.6 million houses over the next 5 years. Now from memory, the Help to Buy scheme had a lot of issues for these people when they went to sell their houses, but I can't remember the details. Okay, so that's the Conservatives. What do you make of that? Yeah, mixed bag, but some good news for some people, but just maybe not enough detail in there about how things are going to be funded. Next in the polls, we're looking at Reform. Now, Reform UK calls their manifesto a contract with the people. For convenience, I'll carry on calling it a manifesto. Now, unsurprisingly, it places immigration at the top of their priorities. Firstly, they say that non-essential immigration will be frozen, with people like healthcare workers among those they would class as essential. Foreign students would no longer be allowed to bring partners and children with them when they come over to study, and employers would have to pay a 20% national insurance charge for foreign workers, with exceptions for healthcare and very small businesses. Illegal migrants arriving on the boats will be picked up and returned to France. I suspect the French might have something to say about that. Might take a bit of negotiation. The manifesto also prioritises small businesses, as the Conservatives did, but with some big concessions, such as a corporation tax-free allowance of £100,000 in profits, and the VAT threshold will be raised from £90,000 to £150,000, and that's the point where they would start, and they would have to register and start paying VAT. The manifesto appears to be quite open when it comes to detailing how they will raise the extra revenue required to cover their spending. Now, they reckon 30 billion a year could be raised by scrapping the net zero targets. Reform states that the UK is adding no additional greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. They also plan to raise 35 billion a year by stopping the banks paying interest on bonds that they hold at the Bank of England worth £700 billion. Now, they describe these plans as radical but achievable, and they're certainly very different, and they seem to be causing a lot of anguish with some of the other parties and attracting a lot of criticism too. But could they be achievable? Who knows? The manifesto also sets out an extra £17 billion a year for the NHS, which is significantly higher spending than any of the other parties. They claim this would eradicate NHS waiting lists in 2 years. Reform also says the NHS must use the private sector to take more pressure off its services. Now, on education, there's several promises. Reform's manifesto says that they will scrap interest on student loans for university students, which is sure to attract some interest from younger voters, I'm sure. And when it comes to private education, Reform plans to encourage parents to send their children to independent schools to ease the burden on state schools, with the promise of a 20% tax relief on fees. And it also pledges to ban the promotion and teaching of transgender ideology in primary and secondary schools. Now, that will mean no gender questioning, social transitioning or pronoun swapping in schools, and it also pledges that parents will be informed about their children's life decisions. They also promise to replace the Equality Act and scrap the rules about diversity, equality and inclusion. Now, interestingly, it would also ban the teaching of critical race theory in primary and secondary schools. This is something that the government has criticised, the critical race theory. They've criticised, but haven't actually done anything about it. Now, at its base level, in case you don't know, this ideology promotes the idea that all white people are the oppressors and teaches white children to feel ashamed of being white. On the other side, it instills into non-white pupils the concept that they are victims. Now, as an additional bit of legislation, they say, Reform says, it will cut funding to universities that foster political bias or the cancel culture. That's a bit different. Reform, on something I think we all expected, Reform plans to scrap HS2, which they say would save £25 billion. And they've also promised to scrap London's ultra-low emission zone and the low traffic neighbourhoods. And the party would also get rid of the ban on sales of petrol and diesel cars from 2030. Stamp duty threshold is going to be raised to £175,000 from the current level of £250,000. And as we reported in a video short the other day, Reform has promised to scrap the TV licence. The party called the BBC out of touch, wasteful and institutionally biased. So there you go, that's Reform for you. Anything there that you didn't expect, anything you're particularly pleased about or cross about, do let us know in the comments. And now we come to Labour. They are currently the front runners, according to the polls. And Labour says in their manifesto they plan to create wealth and improve living standards for working people. And it plans to remove inflation and encourage investment but it seems pretty thin on the ground in explaining how they intend to achieve it. Their tax and spending plans are quite modest too. They intend to end or change the non-dom status, which they hope will raise £8 billion, and they want to deter tax avoidance, which, bear in mind, is legal, not to be confused with tax evasion, which is illegal. So Labour's plan for education to ease the burden on state schools is to levy VAT on private school fees, the polar opposite of Reform's pledge. The manifesto claims that the levy will pay for 6,500 extra teachers in state schools in England. But I have to wonder how this will work out without massive investment in school buildings themselves. The availability of school places is almost non-existent in many parts of the country, largely in areas that have seen an explosion of house building, and in consequence massive increases in their local populations, all of which places a huge strain on schools and healthcare in particular. So it's a great idea, extra teachers, fantastic, but we do need somewhere to put them. Labour has virtually matched the Tory pledge by promising to build 1.5 million homes over 5 years. However, they acknowledge it won't be easy. Less than 150,000 homes were built over the last 12 months. Now, in direct opposition to reform, the manifesto pledges to reinstate the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, which is just 7 years away. In terms of healthcare, they plan to deliver for an extra 40,000 appointments, operations and scans a week. And they say this will be possible by having more weekend services and, like reform, by using more private contracts. Now, in tandem with this, the manifesto sets out principles by which they will change the care system in England, but it gives no information as to how. It just states that they will work towards it, and the principle will be to help people live independently. Now, Labour also says it's committed to the nuclear deterrent and to NATO, but it says there will have to be an in-depth review of the threats we face before we know what that commitment would look like. Unlike other parties, there's no comment about immigration that I can see, and I wondered if that might be a concern for some voters. I'm not here to give my opinions about these manifestos. I have made a couple of general observations, but I will comment on the parties themselves. For example, the Lib Dems were always the third party, but they lost traction, I think, after their stint in the coalition. I doubt anyone thinks about them anymore when it comes to a general election. Most of the attention goes to those who shout the loudest, and the Lib Dems don't really make that much noise. The Tories, well, they've really shot themselves in the foot over the past few years and appear to have alienated a vast swathe of the population that was probably staunchly conservative in the past, and I think they will struggle in the polls this time around. I think there are two main problems for reform. One is Nigel Farage himself. He's very much a Marmite politician. You either love him or hate him. He is, however, very charismatic, and the other party leaders, well, they appear quite bland by comparison, don't they? The other problem is that they have a manifesto that could appeal to a lot of people, but they won't be forming the next government. It's pretty evident to everyone that Labour will win the election, so Nigel Farage will not have the opportunity to see his party's contract with the people come to fruition. There is, however, a groundswell of opinion that Reform might become the opposition party, and if that were to happen, then at least the country knows what to expect from Farage as an opposition leader and his policy aspirations for heading towards 2029. And you never know, miracles could happen. Could suddenly see a massive swell of voting for them and Reform could get in, which would be a totally historic landmark. But going by the polls, well, I can't see it happen, because judging by those polls, we know they're going to win. Labour's going to win. But is Sir Keir Starmer the right choice to be at the top? Has the party alienated so much of the working classes now? I mean, working people seldom have good things to say about the rich elite, even if they're heading a workers' party. Now, I know I've only given you some of the bullet points, But what do you think of the manifestos? Is there anything there that surprised you, pleased you, or angered you? Do you know who you're going to vote for and why? Do let us know in the comments. As always, please keep the comments calm and respectful of others' opinions. Now, from what I've seen of the debates, interviews and pundits' opinions, I reckon this is now a two-horse race between Labour and Reform, with Labour the favourite to win, probably by a few lengths, and Reform hopefully should make a good sound second place. The Tories could be worth an each-way punt, however I suspect the Lib Dems will run out of steam after the first couple of furlongs. And as for the Greens, well, they're likely to be at the back of the field in what would be a maiden race under the current trainers, but if the going's hard, I reckon they won't make it out of the gates. Political comedy? Probably not. I think that's enough of the horse racing analogies for now. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed this one. Until the next time on Grey Matters, it's bye for now. Thank you.